Good morning, everyone. Delighted to have you all here on a Saturday morning. I will briefly go over some basic shipping terminology and sort of important things to know when thinking about emissions from vessels and also the work Civic Exchange has been doing and then some of the policy context just briefly. So we've been convening air quality scientists, public health scientists, government officials, and industry and other key stakeholders for several years in our sort of Green Harbors work. And this is consistent with the style of collaboration that we have at Civic Exchange. But before I get into that in a little more detail, I just wanted to sort of follow up from what Jim was saying on bunker fuel. And really what I want to say here is that the fuel that is used in the largest ocean-going vessels is much dirtier than what is used in local craft. So that they use different types of fuel on the ocean-going vessels as they do on local craft like ferries and tugboats and barges here in Hong Kong. And so the sulfur content in bunker fuel would be around 2.5 to 3.5%, whereas the sulfur content in the fuel used, distillate fuel used in local craft would be in Hong Kong around 5% and cleaner. The other thing I'd like to say is that ocean-going vessels can carry different types of fuel on board at one time. And this is important in terms of regulation, which I'll get to in a minute. As Jim just mentioned very briefly, and I will too, there are different ways of reducing emissions from vessels. We're primarily focused on fuel switching at the moment because it is, as Jim says, a timely way to reduce emissions quickly, and it doesn't require a technological fix. Other ways of another sort of operational way to reduce emissions is to slow the speed of a vessel, and then the more sort of tech-heavy ways of reducing emissions from vessels include shoreside power, which is literally plugging the ship into electricity when alongside at berth, and also scrubbers, which deal with the emissions that come out of the funnel. In terms of international regulation, the UN body that looks specifically at ships is called the International Maritime Organization, and they have a convention that looks at marine pollution in general. Annex 6 of that deals specifically with air emissions. And now there's a subclause, and the global cap now is 3.5% sulfur content fuel, and that will progressively get tighter over the next few years. Now a agreement, I suppose, our friends from Europe and EU can go into this in a little more detail during the panel discussion, but you can have even tighter sulfur standards than MARPOL Annex 6 in what they call emission control areas, or ECAs. And at the moment, the limit for those for sulfur content is 1%, and that's going to be reduced to 0.1% sulfur content fuel in 2015. There's also some regional regulation. The EU ports, for example, they have a directive which restricts the fuel use to 0.1% as well. California also has some similar regulations. And so the thing to keep in mind when we're talking about these ocean-going vessels in Hong Kong is that if they're calling at those ports elsewhere, they have the fuel on board already. They have the cleaner fuel on board already to be able to use it here. So in terms of operations, there's no challenge to do that here. In terms of fuel supply, if you fill up in Europe, you can come to Asia, use the cleaner fuel here, and then go back to Europe on the same tank of fuel. So that's something to keep in mind. And the shipping lines know this, and they understand the trend is to clean up in the region, and Mr. Teddy Fong will be able to speak more on the industry initiative later this afternoon. And Civic Exchange's interest comes, on many ways. But what's interesting about this chart, well, the important thing to note is that last year in 2010, the top 8 busiest container ports in the world are in Asia, 9 if you want to include Dubai. Of that, Hong Kong, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou are, in the top 7. And as Jim was saying, this is a tiny, tiny region. So the imperative, like when you're thinking about sustainability issues and you have such an enormous port, like what does it mean for green ports policy when you have the density of people next to the density of vessel traffic and container throughput. And here we can see in Hong Kong that just how close. I mean, we all know. I mean, we're sort of, a few short kilometers away from where the ports are in town here. What we've also found using the Headley Index out of HKU and Chinese U and other public health and air atmospheric science schools, HKUST is also involved, is that urban air quality is affected by emissions from ships in Hong Kong. So on the far side, you can see looking at sulfur dioxide. The ambient levels in Hong Kong generally are much lower than the levels of sulfur dioxide in the Kwai Chung district in particular. And this, of course, is adjacent to port activity, and we can attribute this to port emissions. And this is using Jim's research, which we've been making heavy use of these last few years. Again, looking at this map, if we see that the emission control area that exists at the moment is in Northern Europe, where you can see a cluster of mortality dots, and also North America is implementing an ECA as of next year. And so that will address sort of the public health concerns in North America. But over here, as Jim was pointing out, this is where we have a big public health concern. And as a policy think tank, we're thinking, well, what is the regulation that needs to come in place to address this? So we've been, again engaging with the Green Harbors community. And the major finding that we've had when bringing all these different stakeholders together is that the industry wants to be cleaner in the region. They're asking for regulation, which is not typical of industry, as I understand from our guest from Europe. But this regulation must be both across the Pearl River Delta region for all the competition issues we were talking about, and also the airshed issues. We're all breathing the same air, we're all very close to each other, and also consistent with MARPOL Annex 6 and ECAs in particular. So whether or not we go through that ECA process to have it, or if we do something in our own territorial waters, which we can do without the international convention, whatever it is, it must be consistent so that just operationally it's much easier for the ships to have the right fuel on board. They don't have to carry sort of, a half dozen types of fuel to comply with various regulations. It's all the same regulation everywhere. So Mr. Fong will talk about this in more detail, but the Fair Winds Charter, I mean, this is real industry leadership, and we really need to emphasize this, that the voluntary actions that the industry has taken have been critical in helping with the policy development and support in the region. And just very briefly, looking at policy, we can see there has been, sort of macro levels of general policy in coming from mainland China through the NDRC, and also in the last 3 years, more and more statements of policy intent that sort of show the need to be both sustain GDP growth, but also increase the quality of life in the region. So environmental considerations need to be taken into account, and that must include cleaner shipping and more broadly, cleaner port activities in general, the containers that are the cargo handling equipment, the trucks that service the ports and so on must be also part of this. And then at the moment, there is a consultation document that's going, that is out at the moment, and you're all welcome to comment on this, but what I'm really interested in is page 32, where they specifically mention emission control area for the region in this government consultation document. And this is a joint document between the Hong Kong, Guangdong, and Macau governments talking about how we can make this quality living area possible across the border. There's a lot of talk about collaboration and the need to jointly form policies that are consistent across the region. So this is a hugely exciting consultation document, and please get your views in by the end of the month when the consultation period ends. And as Secretary Lau said, I mean, the policy on address on October 12th also enforces. So we're getting this consistent message of policy from government as well. And then regionally in Singapore, there is a subsidy program that came about to encourage ships to switch to cleaner fuel there. In Japan, there's a panel, a working group looking at the possibility of an ECA in Japan. In Taiwan, Shanghai, and Hong Kong, we've all been doing marine inventories of some description, some including portside activities and others just on vessels. But this is a critical first step in order to have the data to make that evidence-based policy. So this is essential work that my colleague Simon will speak about next. And with that, I'll just lead straight into you, Simon. So thank you very much.